So from Pilate's place to the place of crucifixion just outside of Jerusalem. Verse 33 calls it the place called the skull. All of our terms for this place have to do with that idea of a skull. Golgotha is Aramaic word that means skull. The Greek word here is cranion, similar to our word cranium. We sometimes call it Calvary, which is Latin word that has the same idea of a skull or the top of your skull. Despite the fact that our hymns often call it a hill, the Bible never calls it that, just a place. And the place of the skull, what does that mean? Maybe it means that it was maybe it was a hill, you know, a bald hilltop that reminded you of a skull. Maybe it in some other way had the appearance of a skull. You've probably seen the picture of that hillside outside of Jerusalem that has the pock marks in it. It's almost impossible that looked that way at the time of Jesus. There's been just so much done through war and in that area that's very unlikely the site of the crucifixion. But that could be the kind of reason why the place got its name. My personal opinion is that it was probably called the place of the skull because that's how it was used to kill people. And so it was named by its use. And so this morning we follow Jesus from Pilate's place to the place of the skull. So we'll begin, as we usually do, by looking at the basic facts, and then we'll try to consider some of the meaning. We will come back to Luke 23, but will you turn now to two places, Matthew 27 and John 19. Matthew 27, beginning in verse 27. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand. And they knelt down before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him and took the reed and began to beat him on the head. After they had mocked him, they took the scarlet robe off him and put his own garments back on him and led him away to crucify him. You see there in verse 31 that Jesus' own clothes were put back on him for the journey to the cross. There's no comment made about the crown of thorns, whether they took that off or left it on. I don't know. You see the word they in verse 31. They had mocked him. They took the robe off. They led him away. That they goes back to verse 27. The soldiers of the governor and the whole Roman cohort. This is the cohort that had come along for the arrest of Jesus. So that large crowd of Roman soldiers now leads Jesus away to crucify him. There were probably some of the Jewish soldiers, the temple guard, involved as well. And then somewhere nearby, or even in the same group, were two other criminals being led away to the place of the skull for execution. John 19 now, in verse 17. John 19:17. They took Jesus, therefore, and he went out, bearing his own cross, to the place called the place of a skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. We have other ancient references to this practice of making a condemned person carry his own cross. Now, we don't know for sure what method of crucifixion was used for Jesus. They continue to find new things, meaning new skeletons that help them. In other words, they keep finding new crucified skeletons that help them understand what may have happened during this time period or what may have been the normal thing that was done. So there are several different ways in which Jesus could have been crucified, but if it's definitely possible that the traditional view is right, that there was a vertical beam already prepared at the place of the skull, and then there was a cross beam that was carried by the person who was going to be executed. So go back now to Luke 23. And you remember that we read in Luke 23 that Simon was recruited to carry the cross or the cross beam, possibly, for Jesus. So John 19 says Jesus went out carrying the cross, and And Luke 23 says that Simon, on their way, was recruited to carry the cross for him. So the Bible doesn't explain that, but it seems reasonable to guess that after a grueling night and a brutal night, Jesus was unable to carry that crossbeam very far. And so on their way out of the city, they recruited someone to help, but recruit is a little bit too mild of a word. You see Luke 23:26, they seized a man. Matthew and Mark say they pressed him into service. Since the Romans were the ruling and conquering power, they probably had the authority to make citizens do things like this whenever they wanted. You remember in Matthew 5, Jesus said, whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. That's probably a reference to the same idea that when you're under occupation, you never know when a soldier might make you do something. And so Simon was not asked to volunteer here, but was volunteered for this job. Simon of Cyrene, it says. Cyrene was a city in North Africa, modern Libya. But Simon is a Jewish name, and there is lots of evidence, both in the New Testament and from other sources, that there was a considerable Jewish community in the city of Cyrene, and also that there was a considerable community of Cyrenians in Jerusalem. So it's likely that Simon was a Jew from Cyrene who had either come to Jerusalem as a pilgrim for the feast, or else maybe he even lived in Jerusalem. Behind Jesus and Simon then in this procession was a large crowd of people. A Roman cohort would normally consist of about 600 men, though we don't know if it was the whole cohort that's involved here. But then you add Pilate's soldiers, probably some temple soldiers, a large crowd of the common people, and together it made for quite a parade of people brought together by these very unusual circumstances, weaving their way to the place of the skull. It's interesting to observe that throughout this narration of the crucifixion for us in the Gospels, the focus is often not on Jesus, but on those around Jesus. So that's the case here in this text. So I want us now to consider more carefully some of the people in this crowd. We'll start with the soldiers. Little is said about the soldiers here other than that they had been beating and mocking and mistreating Jesus, that they take him to the cross, and that they recruit Simon on the way. We'll see more about them during the crucifixion. But these would have been mostly Roman soldiers, though possibly a few Jewish as well. And throughout this trial, they have been mockers. Most recently, this was the case with the Roman soldiers, as we just read. But if you look back in Luke 22 at verse 63, this is when Jesus is at the house of the high priest. Luke 22:63. Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him and beating him, and they blindfolded him and were asking him, saying, "Prophesy, who is the one who hit you?" And they were saying many other things against him, blaspheming. So don't picture just one episode of soldiers gathered around mocking Jesus and that kind of thing. You need to picture several episodes of that happening through this about 10 or 12 hours of the trial. And it's not a surprise that soldiers are mocking. You can guess without having to be very imaginative that these soldiers thought of themselves as being strong, tough young men. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I hope our soldiers in our military are strong, and I hope I want our law enforcement officers to be strong on our behalf. Yet at the same time, there's a temptation for soldiers or police officers or young men in general to get an inflated view of their own strength. I've never had too much of a problem with that myself, at least in the physical sense. But especially for men like these soldiers who didn't know the truth, who hadn't been humbled under the gospel of grace, it's very easy for young men, especially strong young men, military young men, to think they're all tough, they're all that. And to, together with that, then mock someone who claims to have some kind of power or authority over them. They thought they had power and authority. They had strength. They were in charge. And here comes this peasant from Galilee, and he claims to be stronger. He claims to be a king, and they laugh. When Jesus claimed to be in charge, they laugh. Funny thing is, those guys are long gone. I think their strong muscles have turned back into the dust from which they were created. Oh, the foolishness of confidence in human strength. We are all weak. We are all dying. It's not that at some point in your life you start the dying process. Like you're young and you're strong, and then at some point things start going wrong. Things start going wrong from the beginning. You are dying. When you're young and strong, you're dying. God might grant us graciously some season in our youth when that is masked to some degree, but the Bible will not let us forget it. It says, isn't your life like a vapor that appears for a little while and then it vanishes away? So let not the mighty man boast in his might, but instead remember your Creator in the days of your youth. And give glory to God, the King of glory, Yahweh strong and mighty, Yahweh mighty in battle, he's called, Psalm 24:8. That was who stood before them. He says this, the everlasting God, Yahweh, the creator of the ends of the earth, he does not become weary or tired. His understanding is inscrutable. He gives strength to the weary, and to him who lacks might, he increases power. Though youths grow weary and tired, just try to get him out of bed in the morning. Though youths grow weary and tired, and vigorous young men stumble badly, yet those who wait for Yahweh gain new strength. Right? Little did they know that this Jesus could be their strength, his grace sufficient for them, his power perfected in their weakness that they didn't even think they had. This Jesus could be the king for them, far greater than Caesar, the great general, you know that Lord of hosts in the Old Testament, Yahweh of armies. Zephaniah calls him a mighty warrior in Zephaniah 3:17. They were standing before the greatest soldier ever. On this very day, Jesus would deal a death blow to two enemies that no Roman soldier could ever touch, and that is Satan and death. This Jesus was so strong that he could be the life in their death. So when you consider Jesus, isn't it clear that we should never depend upon or look to our own strength? And if God grants to you a season of health, if God grants to you a season of strength, remember your Creator. He granted it to you, a dying person, for his sake, his glory, and for your good. That also means that you do not have to grab hold of youth and strength and health as things that must be clung to at all costs. I understand the desire for health. And I think you should try to eat well, and I think you should try to exercise, and I understand those things. But Christians do not have to have this obsession about health that so many in our world have, because you are dying. And you try to take good care of this body as long as you can, but you're dying in God's time, and you're not going to change it. And so take good care of yourself for his sake and rest. You know what's going to happen when your strength is gone? His strength isn't going to be gone. You know what's going to happen when you're not here anymore to serve the Lord? God's work's going to just keep right on going, and you're going to be better off. So stop trying to stay here so long. Some 10-year-old's going to be at lunch today and say, Mom, let me drink all the Coke I want. Pastor said it doesn't matter. And I'm going to be in trouble. Maybe it'll be a 40-year-old. I'm having seconds on dessert. That's not what I said. Don't be like these soldiers. I'm strong. I'm tough. You're not going to tell me what to do. No, you're not strong and you're not tough. Jesus is the mighty warrior. Okay? Then there was this large crowd of people with their varied motivations for being there. Many of them had been in the mob at the trial. Others were surely some followers of Jesus who were watching from a distance. But Jesus suddenly spoke. And it must have been quite startling for everyone. Here's this procession on its way from the city to the place of the skull, and Jesus has been quiet for so long, and you have to imagine that he's just struggling to trudge along here in all of the pain, and he suddenly picks up his head and looks toward one group of people within the crowd, and he speaks to them. And I mean, admittedly, it was an especially noisy group that he spoke to, but look at Luke 23, verse 27. And following him was a large crowd of the people and of women who were mourning and lamenting him. And do not picture like quiet sobbing. This is Middle Eastern ritual wailing. That's very loud that's being done by these women. But Jesus, turning to them, said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children." So these women are wailing a probably traditional funeral dirge. But now, who are they? Based on what Jesus says to them here, it's quite clear that these women are not the same as that group of women who were followers of Jesus, because Jesus would not have said these things to that group of women. These are other women, and so we have to ponder, why are they there? Why are they mourning? And what seems to be most likely is that this kind of mourning for the dead was a very common practice in Israel at that time. We know that. And we think that it was even something that was considered to be kind of like a good work, like a good deed that you could do. Now, that's hard for us to understand in our American culture, where we avoid death at all costs. You know, you're not going to go to somebody's funeral that you don't know just to do it, something like that. But maybe it helps to think of like the people who volunteer to come to the airport when soldiers return from duty, or who come to show their respects at funerals of soldiers or law enforcement, even if they don't know them. Or maybe even someone who goes and places flowers on the gravestones of people they don't even know. It's kind of like a good work, kind of like a contribution to society. And that really is the most likely explanation of what's going on with these women. They probably made a regular practice of mourning the dying or seeking to show some sympathy for those on their way to execution. And I don't know if this is true or not, but it's not hard to... They might have even been aristocratic, like important women, and this was something that they did. I know they wouldn't do that today, but it was a different culture. Something they did as part of good deeds to society. Mourn those, and also, you know, there was a certain sense that Rome is killing these people, and so let us mourn for our Jewish brothers and sisters who are being executed by Rome, even if they are criminals. So I think probably something like that is going on. And so the point being, I don't think you should think of them as broken-hearted, repentant people who are mourning the death of Jesus. That's not who these women are. They are participating in some kind of ritualistic funeral dirge. And so Jesus, it must have startled them when Jesus interrupts their wailing and says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me." When he says, "Daughters of Jerusalem," that is intended to sound prophetic. Israel's prophets had often, if you just go look up "daughters of Zion" or "daughters of Jerusalem" in the Old Testament, you'll find it many times. The prophets had often addressed them, and Jesus had been trying to warn the people of Israel that the prophetic tides were crashing onto shore, that the warnings of the prophets were coming true. And so Jesus says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children." There's a passage in Isaiah that I think is very appropriate for this. This is just excerpts from Isaiah 32. Isaiah said, "Rise up, you women who are at ease, and hear my voice. Give ear to my word, you complacent daughters. Within a year and a few days, you will be troubled, O complacent daughters. Tremble, you women who are at ease. Be troubled." That's similar to what Jesus is saying is here to these women, shaking them out of their complacency. You think you're doing a good deed by mourning for me. Stop. Mourn for yourself. Why? Because destruction is coming upon your city and your people, your husbands, and your children. See Luke 23, verse 29. "For behold, the days are coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us.'" This is just 35 years later that Jerusalem is horrifically conquered. And so Jesus could not bear to hear them wailing for him because he knew exactly what was going to happen to them. Over and over again, Jesus had warned about it. And now he tells these women, soon you're going to wish you had not had children because of what your children are going to have to go through. And even more startling in verse 30, Soon, you're going to wish you could be buried alive than go through what you're going to go through. Weep for yourselves. And then in verse 31, he says, "For if they do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" And that proverb simply means that things are going to get much worse. If fire consumes a green tree, what's it going to do to a dry tree? It's hard to know exactly what's meant by the green tree and the dry tree here, but my guess would be that he's saying, it's not yet the full time for your judgment. It's almost here. The tree's not dried out fully yet. But if Rome is doing this to me now, if this is what it's like while the tree's green, what's it going to be like when it's ripe, when it's dry, when it's time for what's Rome going to do then? And that's exactly what happened 35 years later. So Jesus says, don't weep for me, weep for yourselves. Begin to consider your own spiritual need. There are many people who, in the name of religion, weep for various things. You can go into churches and cathedrals and shrines and find people kneeling down before Mary or pictures of saints or an altar to ancestors, and you might see tears running down their cheeks. And I think for many people, crying is something that feels spiritual. But crying in itself is empty unless we are considering our true spiritual need. The weeping that matters is when we weep over how selfish we are and how covetous we are and how little we love God and how often we don't even think about Him and how willingly we rebel against Him. And so just like Jesus commanded these women to weep for themselves, the Bible often commands us to weep for our sin. But the problem is that we live in a world that just greatly discourages weeping. When someone cries, one of our very first tendencies is to say, don't cry, it's okay. Our first words are, don't cry. We live in the world of don't worry, be happy, the power of positive thinking. Again this week, someone told me sheepishly, yeah, I like to watch Joel Osteen a lot. He's just so positive. Listen, Isaiah spoke of how often God calls people to weep and wail and mourn, but instead they party. Let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we might die. That's Isaiah 22:12 and 13. Jesus said, Luke 6:25, woe to you who are well fed now, for you shall be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. If you ignore your spiritual need in this life, you'll weep for eternity. It's not that we're saying that Christianity is a sad religion that tells everyone to cry all the time, but that there is no true joy until you have truly wept. And don't judge the genuineness of your salvation by how many tears you shed, okay? Because that's partly connected to personality and physiology and other things, right? You don't always get to choose like how voluminously you cry. But this weeping we're talking about is primarily something that happens in your heart. And how much comes out of your eyes varies by person. But it's your heart weeping over the fact that you can just live without God day after day after day and not even pay any attention to Him. And you can not love God and you can rebel against God and it doesn't bother you at all. And at some point your heart has to be broken and you've got to say, what am I doing? How am I living? How can I treat God this way? And you'll never come to true joy until you've wept like that, right? And really, what James describes for us is that weeping over our sin is a first step of drawing near to God. He says, draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be miserable, and mourn, and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning, and your joy into gloom. The Bible says to some people, stop laughing, and stop being joyful. Because it's a Band-Aid that's covering up your true problems. Humble yourselves in the presence of the Lord, and He will exalt you. With the commands to weep also comes a promise. Jesus tells us to weep for ourselves, and then He wipes away our tears. Yahweh is near to the brokenhearted. He saves those who are crushed in spirit, Psalm 34:8. The sorrow that is according to the will of God produces a repentance without regret, leading to salvation. And Jesus said, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh. So this morning we can hear Jesus saying to each of us, weep for yourself. Then we consider Simon of Cyrene carrying the cross. So we've gone from the soldiers to the crowd, these women now to Simon, forced into this duty by the Roman soldiers, so it's not as if he had any choice in the matter. Yet, as we picture Simon, can you picture him coming along behind Jesus, probably with this crossbeam tied onto his back like a big awkward backpack? And when we picture that, we see an illustration of God's call for our lives. Luke 9:23, Jesus had said, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself." So whatever Simon was up to on that day, it just ended. Wherever he was headed, he's not anymore. If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. That's what it's like to be a true follower of Jesus, except that you aren't forced into following Jesus by Roman soldiers. You're drawn to him by love, and you follow him with joy. So being a Christian is kind of like what? Being a Christian is kind of like winning the lottery. Being a Christian is kind of like every day's Disneyland. Being a Christian is kind of like, well, I mean, in a sense, being a Christian is better than winning the lottery and better than every day at Disneyland, but Jesus says being a Christian is kind of like Simon, coming along behind me on the path of suffering, bearing the cross. And yet, that is the best possible place to be. All right, we're going to come back to that. But have you ever wondered if Simon himself came to follow Jesus? Is he just an illustration of discipleship? Or did he, through this experience and in the months and years to come, actually become a disciple? And I think we can say with almost certainty, not quite certainty, but something close, that Simon and his family became true followers of Jesus. Let me show you why. Turn to Mark chapter 15. Mark 15 and verse 21. They pressed into service a passerby coming from the country, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. All right, so Mark is the only gospel writer who chose to tell his readers that Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. So that almost certainly tells us that when Mark wrote his gospel, whoever he first had in mind, the first readers of his gospel, who did they know? Alexander and Rufus, right? Otherwise, why would Mark have any interest in telling them who Simon's children were? So we can be quite certain that whomever Mark was writing this gospel to, they had some awareness of Alexander and Rufus, because Mark wants to make sure they know that this Simon was these men's father. Okay, now let's add this then. Many people think that Mark was likely in Rome when he wrote this gospel. We don't know that for sure, but most people guess that Mark was probably in Rome when he wrote the Gospel of Mark. And it may be then true that Mark's first audience that he had in mind was the Roman church, Christians in Rome. With that in mind, turn to Romans 16. And in Romans 16, verse 13, Paul writes this to the church in Rome: "Greet Rufus, a choice man in the Lord, also his mother and mine." Now that line, his mother and mine, is a little confusing, I know, but it probably means that Rufus's mother was like a mother for Paul too, okay? And you've all had an experience like that probably. So what does Mark say here? I mean, what does Paul say here to the church in Rome? Say hi to Rufus and his mother, who was like a mother to me. Now, if Mark wrote his gospel from Rome, likely, maybe to the church in Rome, first of all, and made sure they knew that Alexander and Rufus were the children of Simon. And if Paul writes to the church in Rome and says that Rufus is a beloved, a choice man in the Lord, and Rufus's mother, say hi to her too, she's been like a mother to me, what do you think all that means? It sure looks like that after this day when Simon of Cyrene met Jesus, that he came to follow Jesus and his wife came to follow Jesus, and they raised sons who came to love and follow Jesus, and one of them became a choice man in the Lord, and that Simon's wife actually ended up in Rome, maybe when Paul was in prison there, being kind of like a mother for Paul. I know that's not certain, but it's not far-fetched either, based on the things that we have seen here. How did all that happen? Because one day, Simon the Cyrene, a Jewish man, was coming into the city of Jerusalem. It was morning or possibly near midday, and it was the feast time. Maybe he was even coming in to begin the preparations for the Passover feast. But the way into the city was clogged up by this large crowd of soldiers and people. You know what it's like when you're coming down a road and all of a sudden you go, uh-oh, something's going on the road up there in front of me. He's coming on this road into the city, and all of a sudden there's this big crowd, and then the Roman soldiers grab Simon and force him to carry the crossbeam for some criminal. Have you ever had something that happened to you that really seemed really bad in the moment, and later you're so thankful it happened? This day was the day that God had planned for Simon to meet Jesus, and what an introduction. Like Saul met Jesus unexpectedly on the road to Damascus, Simon met Jesus unexpectedly on the road out of Jerusalem. And maybe Simon had never even heard of Jesus before this, or if he had lived in Jerusalem, maybe he did. But someday, Simon came to understand, and someday Simon was surely amazed to realize that on that one day at the Passover, his Messiah walked right up the road at him. And Simon helped to carry his cross behind him. Someday he came to realize that was the best place to be, though he surely didn't want to be there in the moment. Taking up your cross to follow Jesus, it doesn't sound very exciting. But when I think of Simon and his wife and his sons and their service to Paul and the church in Rome, I think of the words of Jesus in John 12:24. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Taking up your cross each day to follow Jesus is a path of death to self and your way and where you were headed and what you wanted to do, but it's the path to fruit. And it seems that Simon's whole family came to love and follow Jesus. And I know I'm going beyond what the Bible tells us here, but I can even imagine, okay, if Simon's wife was in Rome and was like a mother for Paul, I'd imagine her, sending cookies or something to Paul in prison, and Simon bringing them. And I can just imagine Simon and Paul sitting there talking through the grate of Paul's prison cell, or maybe when he was under house arrest in Rome, and talking together, these two men, about the days when Jesus met them on two different roads and their lives were changed. I don't know if that happened, but it's not unlikely based on what we're told here. So we've considered the soldiers, the crowd, the mourning women, Simon. Finally, we come toward the front of the procession and find Jesus, beaten, bloodied, trudging quietly toward death. No one takes my life away from me. I lay it down on my own initiative. The King of Glory trudges toward death. At the end, Simon carried his cross, but at the beginning, Jesus carried it. And that reminds us of Isaac, Abraham's son. He too was a child of promise, a great hope. God told Abraham to sacrifice his son, and on the way to the place of sacrifice, Isaac carried the wood for his own death, and apparently willingly, trusting his father. How much more did Jesus go willingly, carrying his own cross, trusting his father? For Isaac, there was a last-second substitute, a ram in the thicket who died in his place. For Jesus, there was no last-second substitute because he was the substitute. And we are the ones who go free. So, the one whom Simon followed is the one worth following. He is the one whom the strong young soldiers should submit to and serve as their king and their general. He is the one whom the weeping women should turn to after they have wept for themselves and their sin and the judgment that's coming upon their people. He is the one whom we should joyfully take up our cross and follow. See, as horrible as this scene was, and has upset as Simon may have been about what happened in those moments, Simon had the best spot of all, right behind Jesus, following him. You don't want to be part of the soldiers. You don't want to be part of that crowd mocking Jesus. He'll devastate them in his fury, Psalm 2. You don't want to be part of the women who pat themselves in the back for their good deeds to society. Jesus will say to them, "Depart from me, I never knew you." You want to be right there with Simon. There is no greater privilege. There's no better place to be. And so sometimes for us too, the path that Jesus leads us down will, first of all, it will seem to completely turn around the direction we wanted to head. Like Simon that day. I'm headed this way. I've got plans. No, you're not. You're going this way. God's done that to a bunch of your lives. And you've said, "God, what are you doing?" The path Jesus leads us down will call us to, in that sense, die to ourselves in our way. And when we turn around and begin to follow Jesus, we may discover, like Simon did, that there's a big crowd of people around you who are not impressed at all and will actually laugh at you. And you'll discover this is not a very happy path. Where are we headed again? And meanwhile, the world will offer you laughs and fun and all kinds of drinks and drugs to distract you from any pain. They'll offer you cheery platitudes and warm, fuzzy movie tunes and even happy sermons. But you don't want their path. It's temporary, it's vanishing, and it ends in an eternity of misery. You want the King of eternity, no matter how hard the path might be. Listen, no matter how heavy the cross might feel, you want to be right there. Some of you are hurting, and your path is really hard, and it feels like it's gone on for a really long time. But this morning, could you say, I don't know where this is headed. I don't know what God's doing, but I believe the best possible place to be is right behind Jesus, following him. I don't want to be anywhere else. Can you say that? There is no better place to be than right behind Jesus, following him, no matter how hard the path may be or how heavy the cross may feel.